Mace Windu had him. That is the part most people don't pause on long enough. Palpatine was on his knees, disarmed. The most powerful Sith Lord in 1,000 years. The man who had secretly been running both sides of a galaxy-wide war for over a decade. Finished. Done. Mace Windu had won. The Jedi were safe. The Republic could be saved. Then a door opened. One man walked through it. He didn't come to rescue Palpatine. He came because he was terrified of losing someone he loved. Because he was desperate. Because he had been slowly, quietly, invisibly prepared for exactly this moment. Over the course of more than 10 years, he didn't know that. He believed he was making a free choice. He believed the moment was his. It wasn't. This is the story of the most patient manipulation in the history of the galaxy. How Palpatine found the one person in the Jedi Order with a wound deep enough to be turned. How he spent over a decade filling that wound with false warmth, false belief, and a promise that no Jedi could ever offer. How he built a weapon out of a hero, aimed it at the one man capable of stopping him, and never once had to pull the trigger himself. Mace Windu was the greatest obstacle between Palpatine and everything he had spent his life building. He was perceptive enough to sense the truth, powerful enough to act on it. He came within seconds of ending the entire plan. He didn't fail because he was outfought. He failed because Palpatine never intended to fight him directly. Windu was never the target. He was the destination. And the weapon that carried Palpatine to that destination had been under construction for over a decade. Walking the halls of the Jedi Temple, fighting the Republic's wars, and loving the wrong people far too much to ever let them go. His name was Anakin Skywalker. To understand how this ended, you have to understand how it began. Not in the Chancellor's office, not in the war, long before any of that. In the gap between who Anakin was and what the Jedi Order could never quite give him, that gap was where Palpatine did his real work. And by the time anyone understood what had been built inside it, Mace Windu was already falling. Mace Windu was many things, but he was above all a man who trusted his own perception. This was not arrogance in the ordinary sense, though it could look like arrogance from the outside, and it frequently did. It was the product of decades of training, decades of immersion in the Force, and a very specific relationship with the dark side of it that no other Jedi of his generation possessed. He had grown up in the Order, brought into the Temple as an infant in the way that most Jedi were, raised within a tradition that was ancient by any measure, and that had shaped him in ways both visible and invisible. He became a skilled fighter early. He became a skilled thinker. He advanced through the ranks of the Order with the kind of consistency that did not announce itself as exceptional because it was simply always there, always evident, always slightly beyond what was expected. By the time he took his seat on the Jedi High Council, he was one of the most respected figures in the Order, and not merely because of his political position, because of what he was. He was the creator of something that had never existed before him. A lightsaber combat form called Varpad, the seventh and most dangerous of the classical forms, a style that had emerged from Windu's own nature and that could not simply be taught the way other forms were taught, because it required something from its practitioner that most Jedi could not safely approach. Most lightsaber forms were built on discipline, efficiency, and the precise management of force and movement. They were about meeting an opponent's aggression and redirecting it, neutralizing it, overcoming it with superior technique and better timing. Even the most aggressive of the classical forms maintained a certain remove, a certain separation between the fighter and the combat itself. Varpard closed that distance entirely. Varpard was about something that most Jedi considered extremely dangerous to go near. The genuine, visceral excitement of a fight, not the dark side. Not anger or hatred, or the desire for domination. Windu understood the distinction between these things with extraordinary precision, and it was a distinction he maintained always. But the aliveness of combat, the way a genuine confrontation between two skilled opponents narrows the entire universe to a single point of pure action, where everything unnecessary falls away and existence becomes shockingly immediate. Most Jedi trained themselves to suppress that feeling because it had a tendency to open pathways to darker emotions. Mace Windu had trained himself to channel it. He had learned to ride it the way a skilled sailor rides a current, not fighting it, not surrendering to it, but using its energy for his own purposes. The danger of this was real, and he knew it was real. 2 of the 3 Jedi who had ever attempted to learn Varpard had fallen to the dark side, consumed by the very thing the technique asked them to approach. Windu had not, and the reason he had not was the same quality that made the technique work for him. He was brutally, uncomplicatedly honest with himself. He could look at the shadow in his own heart without flinching away from it, without constructing philosophical barriers that softened what he found, without telling himself comforting stories about his own virtue. He could see his own darkness and say, yes, that is there, and it is not going to consume me, and now I am going to use it. This gave him a capacity that was almost unique among the Jedi of his era. When he faced a dark side user in combat, he could actually channel their darkness back at them. He could feel the power they were directing against him with a kind of tactile, sensory precision that other Jedi could not quite match. He could use the dark side energy his opponent was pouring into the fight as fuel. He could feel the dark side, in another being the way you might feel the heat of a fire, intensely, precisely, and from close range, without being burned. This is why Palpatine feared him. Not the fighting ability specifically, though that was formidable enough to be a genuine concern. The perception. Mace Windu had spent a lifetime learning the texture of the dark side, the specific quality of its presence in the Force, its particular gravity, its unmistakable signature. He knew what it felt like when he was near it, not in the abstract, not in the way a student who has been told what something is can claim to understand it, but in his body, in his senses, the way a tracker knows a trail. And what this meant in practical terms, in the terms of a galaxy where the Dark Lord of the Sith had been hiding in plain sight for years, was that Mace Windu was the Jedi most likely to notice. He had noticed. That was the truth of it. He had been unable to prove what he noticed, unable to articulate it in terms that could stand as evidence in the political climate of a republic at war, unable to bring the full weight of Jedi authority to bear on it without legal justification. He did not yet have. But the suspicion had been there for a long time, sitting in the place where his perception met his training, telling him quietly and persistently that something was wrong with the Supreme Chancellor of the Republic, that the darkness in the Force, the clouding of Jedi foresight that all of them had been experiencing for years, was not simply the result of the war or of some impersonal disruption in the living Force. That there was a source, that the source was close, that the source was, against every rational expectation, the man who called himself their friend and their ally, and the servant of the democracy they were sworn to protect. The political reality of Windu's position during the Clone Wars was the frustrating one. He was the most powerful fighter on the Council. He was the most attuned to the presence of the dark side of anyone in the Order, and he was consistently, structurally, unable to translate either of these gifts into action, because in the world of the Republic at war, you could not move against the Supreme Chancellor on the basis of a feeling. You needed evidence. You needed a legal framework. You needed the kind of institutional consensus that would allow the Jedi to act without being seen as a faction seizing power, without giving the Chancellor's supporters the ammunition they needed to paint the Jedi as a threat to democratic governance. Windu was not naive about politics. He understood all of this. But understanding it did not make it less difficult to sit in the council chamber day after day, sensing something deeply wrong and be unable to do anything about it. Palpatine understood all of this better than Windu did, because Palpatine had designed the situation. The legal and political constraints that prevented the Jedi from acting on suspicion were not accidents of a democratic system. They were features of an architecture Palpatine had been building for years. An architecture designed precisely to protect him from exactly the kind of action that Mace Windu's perception might otherwise have enabled. The emergency powers that the Senate had granted the Chancellor consolidated authority in ways that made Jedi independence harder to maintain. The war itself created a political environment in which questioning the Chancellor could be framed as undermining the Republic's war effort. The entire situation had been engineered to ensure that by the time anyone in the Jedi Order had grounds to act, it would be too late. The man had to be removed. Palpatine had understood this for a long time. Windu was too perceptive, too powerful, and too uncompromising to be neutralized through ordinary political means. He could not be bought or flattered into complacency the way some figures could. He could not be discredited on grounds that would be believed by the other council members. He could not be simply outmaneuvered because he was too intelligent and too closely attuned to the Force to miss a political maneuver aimed at him. He had to be put in a position where he destroyed himself, where his own virtues, his directness, his willingness to act, his commitment to the Jedi Order's survival became the instruments of his elimination. And to create that position, Palpatine needed a specific tool, one that had been in development for over a decade, one that was now, as the Clone Wars entered their final phase, almost ready. To understand Palpatine, to genuinely understand him, not simply to list his crimes or his titles or the broad strokes of his scheme, you have to begin by discarding almost every instinct that tells you great power seeks obvious expressions of itself. The galaxy's most dangerous being did not look dangerous. He did not project menace in the way that people who imagined the dark side imagined. He did not move through rooms with the kind of weight that makes crowds part and conversations stop. He was a small, elderly man from Naboo who had risen through the mechanisms of democratic politics to become the Supreme Chancellor of the Republic, and who presented himself to the world as someone burdened by the weight of office, worn down by responsibility, devoted beyond his own comfort to the civilization he served. He was beloved. He was trusted. He was, to the vast majority of the people who dealt with him, the embodiment of experienced and steady leadership in a time of almost unbearable crisis. Every word of it was a performance. Beneath the public face was Darth Sidious, Dark Lord of the Sith, the culmination of 1,000 years of patient scheming the living heir to a tradition of power and deception so long and so thoroughly maintained that its origins lay in the rubble of civilizations most people in the Republic had never heard of. The Sith had been building toward this for a millennium. Darth Bane had established the rule of two after the near annihilation of the Sith Order, recognizing that the Brotherhood of Darkness had always destroyed itself through internal conflict, through the chaotic proliferation of Sith who could not resist turning on each other when they gathered in sufficient numbers. Bane had imposed a brutal discipline on his tradition. 2 Sith at any given time. A master and an apprentice. No more. The concentration of their power, the secrecy of their existence, and the forced evolution of each generation through the only succession the rule of two permitted the apprentice destroying the master had produced over 10 centuries, an increasingly refined and increasingly terrible lineage of dark side wielders. And the final product of that lineage was Palpatine. He had been trained by Darth Plagueis, who was himself one of the most intellectually gifted Sith in the Order's recorded history. Where most Sith Lords had been warriors, Plagueis was a scientist. He approached the dark side with the rigor and the patience of a scholar, probing its deepest mechanisms, mapping its relationship with the midi-chlorians, the microscopic life that mediated the Force in all living things. He believed that the boundary between life and death was not an absolute one in the Force, that it was a permeable threshold that a sufficiently skilled practitioner could learn to influence. He worked toward this for decades, accumulating knowledge, refining technique, coming closer year by year to an understanding that had eluded every Force user before him. He shared this work with his apprentice. He gave Palpatine everything he had learned, because that was the relationship as the rule of two defined it. The Master's entire accumulated knowledge passed to the one who would eventually supersede them. What Plagueis could not entirely account for was how thoroughly Palpatine had already superseded him before the transfer was complete. Palpatine had taken everything his master offered and used it to become something that Plagueis had not fully anticipated. A Sith whose mastery extended not just to the Force and to combat and to the manipulation of midi-chlorians, but to the manipulation of institutions, of political systems, of entire civilizations. Plagueis had thought in terms of power over life and death. Palpatine thought in terms of power over everything. When the moment came when Palpatine was certain that he had received all his master had to give, and that Plagueis had begun to imagine a partnership of equals, a future in which two immortal Sith Lords ruled together, he acted. He killed Plagueis in his sleep. He did it without ceremony or warning, in the Sith tradition that demanded it, because the rule of two allowed for no continuations. There was a master, and there was an apprentice, and eventually there was only the apprentice. What Palpatine wanted was not limited to the destruction of the Jedi Order, though he wanted that and would have it. He wanted total domination. He wanted a galaxy in which there were no competing power centers, no independent institutions, no traditions or philosophies or governing bodies that had any claim to authority other than the one he chose to grant. He wanted an empire in the oldest and most absolute sense of the word, a single will expressed through the structure of civilization itself. And he had been working toward this from before the Clone Wars began, engineering every major piece of the machinery that would bring it about. The Clone Wars were his creation. The Separatist movement was his instrument, fronted by Count Dooku, who was himself a Sith Lord, another apprentice in the line. carrying out orders he believed served a larger purpose that only Palpatine understood in full. The Senate vote that granted the Chancellor emergency powers had been engineered. The clone army, which appeared at the exact moment it was needed to prevent the Republic's destruction, had been commissioned a decade earlier by a Jedi Master who had been acting, unknowingly, at the end of a chain of influence that traced back to Sith planning. The scale of what Palpatine had done was, when viewed whole, almost impossible to take in. He had built both sides of the war. He had ensured that the Republic would fight for its survival, using soldiers who would one day destroy the institution they currently defended. He had done all of this while maintaining the role of the concerned statesman, who wanted nothing more than peace and was doing his painful duty in the service of others. The Jedi sensed something wrong. They had been sensing it for years. A darkness over the Force, a clouding of their collective vision, a feeling that events were being shaped in ways they could not trace to any visible source. They had discussed it in the council chamber, had noted it in their own private contemplations, had named it a concern without being able to make it into an action. They were looking for the dark side in the places where it traditionally showed itself, in political extremism, in military aggression, in figures who wore their darkness with some visibility. They were not, in the deepest and most practical part of their thinking, looking for it in the Chancellor's office. They were not looking at the man who smiled at them and thanked them for their service and spoke of his admiration for the Jedi Order with what appeared to be genuine and lasting warmth. Their failure to find Sidious was, in the end, a failure to imagine that the source of the darkness could be so completely and so skillfully concealed inside a role as familiar as the one Palpatine played. He had designed his entire public life around the assumption that they could not imagine it. And as the Clone Wars entered their final months, as the galaxy exhausted itself, fighting a conflict whose true architect sat in a building overlooking the Senate dome, Palpatine had been placing the final pieces of his plan into position. The war was almost over. Not because the fighting had ended, but because its purpose was almost fulfilled. And at the center of the endgame, as it had always been, was Anakin Skywalker. There had never been anyone quite like Anakin Skywalker. This was not a matter of sentimental assessment or the exaggerated praise that exceptional people sometimes attract. It was a measurable fact. A fact that had been established the moment Qui-Gon Jinn held a small blood sample and performed a test whose result made him sit very still for a moment before he trusted himself to speak. Anakin's midi-chlorian count was higher than any in the recorded history of the Jedi Order. Higher than Yoda's, the ancient master who had trained Jedi for 800 years. Higher than any living practitioner of any Force tradition anyone in the Order had ever tested. The number was high enough that it did not feel like a measurement of an individual's Force sensitivity so much as an indication of something that had no clear category, something the Order had never quite encountered before. The prophecy of the Chosen One was old, embedded in Jedi lore, in the way that ancient texts become embedded, present without being constantly cited, believed and not believed depending on who you asked and when you asked them. It spoke of one who would bring balance to the Force, balance between what, exactly, had long been a matter of interpretation and disagreement among Jedi scholars. Balance between dark and light. Balance within the Force itself, in some more fundamental sense. The debate had never been resolved, because the prophecy had never been fulfilled, not in anyone's living memory. When Qui-Gon encountered Anakin on Tatooine, he believed he had found the resolution to the debate, not because the debate had been settled, but because the boy standing in front of him was so unmistakably beyond ordinary that no other framework seemed to fit. Qui-Gon brought Anakin before the council. The council was cautious, as it often was, as perhaps it was designed to be. Caution is a useful quality in a governing body, and the Jedi High Council had cultivated it carefully. Yoda, in particular, was cautious, and his caution was not without foundation. He felt the power in the boy immediately. Felt it the way you feel, a fire when you stand close to one through the heat rather than through the flame itself. He felt something else as well, something that he named carefully and quietly. Fear. Not the ordinary fear of childhood, not the natural anxiety of a small person in a large and uncertain universe. A deep, specific, constitutive fear. A fear of loss. A fear that had already been marked by real loss, the loss of the mother left behind on Tatooine. A wound so fresh it was still bleeding, and that had the quality of something that would not easily be healed. Fear in a child with Anakin's level of Force sensitivity was not merely a psychological concern, it was a structural risk. The dark side of the Force had always found its purchase in emotion. And of all the emotions it worked through, fear was the most reliable. Fear created the desire for control. The desire for control, frustrated, created anger. Anger sustained and deepened, created the kind of hate that the dark side fed on most readily. Yoda had seen this pattern before, had watched it operate in others, and he was seeing the conditions for it in this boy. The power was extraordinary. The fear was also extraordinary. And the two of them together, in the same vessel, was something that warranted very careful attention. The council declined to train Anakin. They said he was too old, which was true in the normal terms of Jedi training. And they said they sensed too much fear in him, which was also true, and which was the more important reason. Then Qui-Gon Jinn died on Naboo with a Sith blade in his chest, and Obi-Wan Kenobi made a promise to his dying master on the floor of a reactor shaft, and the Council's decision was superseded by the weight of a deathbed oath. Anakin Skywalker would be trained. The question of whether this was wise is one that history answered with brutal clarity. But the question is also, for our purposes, the wrong one, because the outcome was not determined by a single decision in a council chamber. The outcome was determined by who Anakin was, by what he carried inside him, and by the fact that Palpatine had already, in the brief days following the liberation of Naboo, identified him as the key to everything. The council made a decision. Palpatine made a longer and more patient one. Who was Anakin Skywalker? Underneath the heroism and the power. Beneath the nickname and the legend and the image of the invincible general who fought separatist commanders and dark Jedi and Count Dooku himself without flinching, he was a man who needed to be needed. He was a man whose first and deepest experience of love had been taken from him at 9 years old, left behind in the binary sunset of a desert world while he went to learn to be something extraordinary, and who had never fully recovered from that specific loss. The grief of it had not softened with time the way most grief eventually softens. It had calcified. It had become part of the architecture of his inner life. A room he could not enter and could not seal off. A presence in him that the Jedi Code's guidance on non-attachment had never quite reached. He formed attachments with an intensity that went beyond what the Code warned against, because the attachments were not simply a character tendency. They were his foundation. The people he loved were not additions to his life. They were the structure that held his life together. Padme, Obi-Wan, Ahsoka, the clone troopers who fought under his command and who he came to know as individuals rather than as soldiers, each of them occupied a specific gravity in his emotional world. A pull that was real and constant, and that he organized himself around. And because the love was that deep, the fear of losing what he loved was that deep as well. He feared loss the way most people fear death, as the end of something fundamental, as the dissolution of what made existence bearable. The Jedi Code had answers for this. Every Jedi Master who had ever addressed the subject of attachment had offered some version of the same core teaching. Release what you cannot hold. Honor what you love, without being ruled by the fear of losing it. Understand that everything in the living force passes, and that the passing is not an ending, but a transformation. These were not empty platitudes. They were the product of millennia of Jedi wisdom, tested in the lives of generations of practitioners, and they were genuinely useful truths for people who could access them. For many Jedi, this teaching was not merely an intellectual position, but a lived reality, a freedom from the specific anguish of attachment that allowed them to be fully present in each moment without the weight of everything they might lose pressing down on them constantly. Anakin could not access it. Not because the teaching was wrong, but because the wound it was meant to address was too deep and too old, and had shaped him too thoroughly for the instruction to reach it. He could intellectually accept that loss was part of life. He could acknowledge, in the way you acknowledge something you know is true but cannot feel, that the people he loved were part of the living force and would eventually return to it. And then he would stand in front of Padme, and the abstract truth would become irrelevant, because the abstract truth was not what was real to him. What was real was her. What was real was the specific, irreplaceable, impossible to replace fact of her presence in his life. And the thought of that presence ending was something he could not approach without the fear taking over entirely. Palpatine had understood all of this from the beginning. He had seen it in the boy on Naboo, and he had filed it away with the patient precision of someone who knows they are looking at an instrument they will one day need to play. Not now, not soon, but eventually, when the time was right, when the fear was sufficiently acute and the alternatives were sufficiently closed off, and the one door Palpatine could offer was the only one left that seemed to open anywhere. Obi-Wan Kenobi was a magnificent teacher. This is not a contested point. He was patient in the deep sense, not merely calm under pressure, but genuinely willing to wait for his students' understanding to develop at the pace it needed. Unwilling to rush the process, committed to the long work of formation rather than the quick satisfaction of results. He was skilled in combat and in negotiation, and in the dozen other disciplines that a Jedi Master was expected to embody. He was devoted to Anakin with a sincerity that was never in doubt, even when their relationship was complicated, even when the complications became significant. Over the years of their partnership, the formal structure of Master and Padawan had given way to something more like brotherhood, a bond between two people who had fought together and bled together and carried each other through circumstances that no formal description of their relationship quite covered. But there was a gap. It was not a failure of love. It was a structural gap, the kind that exists in almost every significant relationship, and that most relationships manage to bridge most of the time. Obi-Wan had taken on the training of Anakin before he was fully ready for it. He had been a Padawan himself, when the promise was made. A young man stepping into the role of master under the pressure of grief and obligation. And he had brought to the relationship not just his considerable gifts, but also his own incomplete development in certain areas. He was naturally inclined toward caution, toward institutional authority, toward the measured and deliberate approach. He found genuine wisdom in the Jedi Code. He believed in the Council's judgment, even when he disagreed with specific decisions. He operated from within a framework that was, to him, not a constraint, but a compass. Anakin operated differently. He operated from the inside out, from his own instincts, his own emotional certainty, his own sense of what was right and what was necessary in a given situation. He could follow Obi-Wan's guidance, and he did follow it consistently for years. But there was always the awareness that the guidance was external to him rather than arising naturally from who he was and what he needed, what the deepest part of him was looking for, the part that had been shaped by his childhood and his losses and his particular relationship with love and fear, was not external guidance. It was unconditional belief. The sense that someone who understood him fully still believed in him without qualification, without the careful hedge, without the note of concern that followed the praise, without the institutional awareness that sometimes made Obi-Wan's affirmation feel conditional in ways Obi-Wan did not intend. The Jedi Council could not provide this. The Council looked at Anakin and saw what it genuinely saw: extraordinary power, genuine heroism, and a persistent set of risk factors that warranted ongoing attention. They made him a knight. They used him extensively in the war. They relied on his abilities in situations where those abilities were the decisive factor. But they had never made him a master, a distinction that mattered to Anakin more than the Council fully appreciated. And they had never fully extended the trust that masters received from the Council. They monitored him with the same concern that they had expressed when he first arrived before them as a boy. They valued him and worried about him simultaneously. And the simultaneous nature of those two responses created something in their relationship with Anakin that read to him, in his private experience of it, as a fundamental withholding. Palpatine had seen this the moment he met the boy on Naboo. He had seen the gap. He had seen the hunger it created. And he had begun, immediately and patiently, to fill it. The relationship between Palpatine and Anakin Skywalker began on Naboo. When Anakin was 9 years old and Palpatine was the planet's senator, a man of quiet warmth and evident intelligence who had taken an interest in the remarkable boy the Jedi had brought back from Tatooine. It was brief, that first encounter. A few kind words. A moment of genuine, seeming attention. The beginning of something so small, it would have been invisible to anyone watching who did not understand what they were looking at. But Palpatine was not planting a seed that would grow in a single season. He was planting something that would take over a decade to flower. And he was patient in ways that most minds cannot quite hold. Because most minds do not think in those timescales. A decade was not long for a plan of this kind. It was barely the foundation. Over the years of Anakin's training, Palpatine cultivated the relationship with exquisite and unhurried care. He found occasions to meet with Anakin during his visits to Coruscant. He wrote to him on campaigns. He expressed interest in his development, asked about his training, about the missions he had undertaken, about his relationship with Obi-Wan and the Council. He listened in a way that felt qualitatively different from the way most authority figures in Anakin's life listened, without assessment, without the undercurrent of evaluation, without the sense that his answers were being measured against some standard. He was not quite meeting. He just listened. And when he responded, what he offered was consistent and uncomplicated. Belief, praise without qualification. The clear and unhedged statement that Anakin was the most gifted Force user he had ever encountered, that his potential was beyond anything the Jedi Order had produced in living memory, that the galaxy was fortunate to have him, and that whatever the Council said about his development or his areas of concern, those assessments could not change the basic fact of what he was. For a young man who had grown up in bondage, who had been separated from his mother at 9 years old and brought into an institution that asked him to process that loss as part of his spiritual training, who had worked for years within a framework that valued him conditionally and praised him with the kind of careful, bounded praise that institutions always give to exceptional individuals, they are also a little afraid of. For this young man, Palpatine's attention was something rare and nourishing, not in a healthy way. In the way that something which fills a genuine void does not always fill it with what the void actually needs. Anakin needed to be believed in. Palpatine believed in him. The fact that the belief was manufactured, that it was a strategic tool, that every conversation had been designed from the beginning to serve Palpatine's ends, none of that was visible to Anakin. He saw what was presented to him. He felt what Palpatine allowed him to feel. And what he felt, across years and years of conversations, was that this was one of the people in the galaxy who truly understood him. The conversations covered a wide range. That was part of the technique. Palpatine talked to Anakin about history and philosophy, about the nature of power, and the responsibilities that came with extraordinary ability. He shared perspectives on the Force that were subtly different from Jedi orthodoxy, not radically different, not in ways that would have flagged themselves immediately to Anakin's training, but different enough to introduce a slight opening over time. A gentle suggestion that the Jedi's understanding of the Force was not the only valid one. A carefully phrased question about whether the Council's decisions always served the people of the Republic most effectively, or whether institutional concerns sometimes shaped their thinking in ways the Code did not acknowledge. These were not arguments. They were questions. And they were the right questions, because they were the ones that resonated with doubts Anakin was already forming on his own. The doubts did not begin with Palpatine. Palpatine simply made them feel more legitimate. He created a space in which Anakin's private uncertainties were not evidence of his own failure, but reasonable responses to genuine problems with the institution he served. As the Clone Wars began and ground forward, the cultivation deepened. Palpatine maintained his access to Anakin, insisted on it, used the emergency powers of wartime to keep the exceptional Jedi General within his circle of direct communication. He positioned himself as a mentor, as a guardian, as the one figure in Anakin's life who held no institutional stake in his compliance, who wanted nothing from him except his flourishing. The dinners, the private meetings, the moments of confidential conversation in the Chancellor's office while the war raged outside, these were not the casual byproducts of a busy man making time for a young friend. They were scheduled, deliberate, and precisely calibrated. Every conversation contributed to the same goal: making Anakin's loyalty to Palpatine stronger and more personal than his loyalty to the Jedi Order, not by attacking the Order directly, by being consistently and convincingly what the Order was not. The Clone Wars did things to the Jedi that Palpatine had anticipated and planned for when he designed the conflict. He had known that putting the Jedi in command of armies would change them. He had known that the daily reality of military command, the necessity of making decisions that cost lives, the requirement to prioritize strategic goals over the humanitarian instincts that were central to the Jedi's sense of themselves, the political entanglement that comes inevitably with military power, would gradually erode the qualities that made the Jedi what they were. Not all at once, not in ways that individual Jedi could easily recognize in themselves or in each other. Gradually, the way water erodes stone, so slowly that the change is only visible when you look at how far things have come from where they started. The Order had entered the war with its principles intact and its identity as independent peacekeepers clearly defined. By the midpoint of the conflict, both of those things were under strain. The Jedi were no longer fully independent. They were funded by the state, equipped by the state, deployed by the state, answerable in significant ways to the executive authority of the Supreme Chancellor. They maintained their own governance in theory, but in practice the war had created dependencies that made genuine independence harder and harder to sustain. And the daily work of command, the command of clone troopers, of military operations, of planetary campaigns, had asked many Jedi to do things that sat poorly with who they believed themselves to be. Things that the code had not quite prepared them for. Things they processed as best they could and carried with them. Anakin felt this more intensely than most because he was more intensely present in the war than most. He was on the front lines. He was making command decisions under pressure, life and death decisions, and then living with them afterward in the way that people who make such decisions always live with them. Not cleanly, not by releasing them into the Force as the code recommended, but by carrying them in the specific, unresolvable way that human beings carry the weight of choices that cannot be undone. He had ordered soldiers to hold positions they could not hold and watch them die there. He had made strategic calls that were correct by military logic and that still resulted in catastrophic losses. He had killed Count Dooku while the man was disarmed, with Palpatine's voice in his ear telling him to do it. And he had done it. And he had had to carry that with him through everything that came after. The Ahsoka crisis was one of the turning points. Ahsoka Tano was Anakin's Padawan, and she had become something more than a student to him. She had become, in the way that the most significant relationships always transcend their formal structure, a kind of reflection, someone who had learned from him, not just combat technique and tactical thinking, but the deeper, harder-to-name quality of trusting your own perception even when the authorities around you suggested caution. She was his in the most direct sense that a master can claim a student. She was partly who she was because of who he was, and he recognized himself in her in ways that made her protection feel like something close to an obligation of identity. When Ahsoka was accused of bombing the Jedi Temple and murdering a fellow prisoner, when the evidence assembled against her was damning and the political pressure to act was intense, the Jedi Council made a decision that Anakin could not fully forgive them for, even after the truth came out. They expelled her from the Order. They stripped her of her trials. They handed her to the Republic Military Tribunal for judgment, removing her from the protective framework of Jedi law. and placing her in the hands of a system over which they had less control. They did it because the evidence was what it was and the politics were what they were, because the Jedi had made a calculation about what they could and could not sustain, given their position in the war and in the Republic's governance. It was a decision made under pressure by people who were trying to do the right thing as they understood it in impossible circumstances. Anakin understood none of that. What he understood was that they had taken his student, someone he knew with absolute certainty was innocent, and delivered her to a system that might destroy her, because it was politically convenient to do so. He fought it as hard as he could within the channels available to him. He found the real culprit. He brought the truth to the council. Ahsoka was exonerated, her name cleared, her place in the Order restored with an offer that was meant to right the wrong. She declined. She walked away. She left the Order that had failed her, walked out into the galaxy without the Jedi framework she had grown up inside, and Anakin stood and watched her go with a feeling he could not entirely name and could not entirely set down. The Council had apologized. The Council had acknowledged that a mistake had been made. The Council had offered the only remedy they had available, which was restoration. A return to the status quo ante, as though the status quo ante was still a meaningful concept after what had happened. And none of it had been enough. Because the thing that had happened was not a procedural failure that could be corrected by restoring a procedural status. It was a revelation of what the institution would do when pressure was applied to the right place. It was a demonstration of the gap between what the Jedi said they stood for and what they actually did when standing for it became costly. Anakin filed this away in the part of himself where the accounting was kept. Padme became pregnant during the final year of the war. She told Anakin on Coruscant, in a private moment before the mission, that would result in the rescue of the Chancellor from Grievous's flagship, the beginning of the end of the formal conflict. The news was the kind that transforms a moment, that makes the room you are standing in suddenly different from what it was a second before, lit differently, weighted differently, containing more of what matters than it contained before. He was going to be a father. They were going to have a child, and beneath the joy of it, immediate and simultaneous with the joy of it, was a shadow he did not know how to name yet, a premonition of something he could not see clearly, but could feel at the edges of his awareness, like the quality of light before a storm changes. And you know, without being able to say exactly how you know that something is coming. The dreams started shortly afterward. They were not ordinary dreams. Anakin knew the difference between the random imagery of sleep and the dreams that carried the quality of vision, the specific weight that force sensitivity sometimes conferred on the sleeping mind. These dreams had that quality. They were vivid and specific. And when he woke from them, the feeling did not dissolve the way ordinary dreams dissolve. It stayed. It sat in him like something physical. In the dreams, Padme died. She died in childbirth, or of some complication of it, in pain and suffering. And he watched it happen and could not stop it, no matter what he did. He tried different things in the dreams, found different doctors, made different choices, arrived at different moments, and none of it changed the outcome. She died every time. He had been here before. Not here exactly, but close enough that his body recognized the territory. He had dreamed of his mother. He had told himself the dreams were anxiety, the product of distance and guilt, and the normal worry of a boy separated from the only parent he had. He had suppressed them, managed them, tried to make them mean less than they felt like they meant. And then he had arrived on Tatooine and found his mother dying. And the dreams had been right. And the grief had turned into something he had never fully recovered from and never fully acknowledged, even to himself. He could not make that mistake again. He would not. The visions of Padme dying were, in the deepest and most private part of Anakin Skywalker's life, not simply a fear to be managed. They were a sentence he could not accept. They were the universe telling him something he had already been told once and had survived once and could not survive again. The loss of his mother had shaped the topography of his inner life in ways that were not fully visible even to him. The rage of that night on Tatooine, the thing he had done in the Tusken camp that he had never spoken of to anyone except Padme, had come out of a grief so complete and so unchanneled that it had simply become something else, something that bypassed grief entirely and went directly to a violence that frightened him. He could not lose Padme. He could not stand in that place again and feel that grief turn into what it had turned into before. He needed an answer. He needed a way to prevent what the dreams were telling him was coming. And he needed it urgently. Because the pregnancy was not abstract. It was real. It was happening. The thing he feared most was no longer a distant possibility. It was counting down. He went to Yoda. Not directly, not with the name of what he feared, because the name would have required him to admit to the marriage, to the pregnancy, to the full scope of what he had kept hidden. He went in the way that people who cannot ask the real question sometimes ask the question nearby. He described the visions in general terms, described the fear of losing someone he loved, asked what the Jedi teaching was in the face of that kind of premonition. What do you do when the Force shows you a loss coming and you cannot accept the loss? Yoda's answer was wise. It was true. It was the distillation of centuries of Jedi understanding about the nature of attachment and the nature of loss and the nature of the living Force. He told Anakin to grieve the living rather than mourning what had not yet passed. He told him that fear of loss was the gateway to the dark side, not loss itself, but the fear of it, the desire to prevent it at any cost. He told him that to truly love something was to hold it with open hands, to let it be what it was without trying to make it stay, to honor its existence rather than fighting its eventual passage. He told him that death was not an ending but a change in the form through which the Force expressed a life. Every word of this was right, and Anakin heard every word of it and walked away unchanged. He could not hold Padme with open hands. His hands did not know how to open in that way. The specific, constitutive fear that lived in him, the fear that had been there since Tatooine, since his mother, since the first time the universe demonstrated what it was willing to take from him, was not a fear that Jedi wisdom could dissolve in a single conversation, or even in a year of practice. It was older than his training. It was part of him in the way that the very first experiences of a life become part of the person that life creates. He needed something else. Something the Jedi could not give him. Something that did not ask him to open his hands and accept loss as the price of love. Something that promised him a different price, a different possibility. Palpatine had known the moment would come. He had been waiting for it. With the patience that characterized everything he did, he had watched Anakin's accumulating grievances with the Council, watched the Ahsoka crisis and its aftermath, watched the way the war was changing the young general in ways that moved him steadily away from the unconditional loyalty to the order that might otherwise have been his protection. He had tracked the relationship with Padme as closely as he could from a distance, understanding its significance in Anakin's emotional architecture without needing to know every detail of it. When the pregnancy became a factor, when Anakin's behavior in their private meetings began to carry a specific quality of fear, the kind of fear that is not about an enemy or a battle, but about something internal, something personal, something being desperately concealed. Palpatine recognized the opening he had been waiting for. He had a piece of knowledge that he had been holding for exactly this kind of moment. A story, a legend, a truth wrapped in the language of Sith tradition, which he could present as something he was sharing reluctantly, in the way that a man shares something dangerous because the person he is sharing it with needs it. He waited for the right setting. He chose the Galaxy's Opera House during a performance of a Mon Calamari production that Anakin came to find him at, and they walked together in the curved corridor behind the Chancellor's private box, away from the audience and the noise of the performance. In a quiet that felt like confidence and intimacy, he praised Anakin, as he always did. He reflected on how far the young man had come. He expressed something that was carefully positioned between admiration and personal feeling, the kind of regard a father might have for a son, if the father were also the son's most important patron and the most powerful man in the civilized galaxy. And then, when the ground was prepared, he offered something new. He had observed, he said, that Anakin seemed troubled in ways that went beyond the normal pressures of the war. He said this with concern, with the apparent desire of someone who genuinely wanted to help, but understood that Anakin had to want the help before it could be given. He created a space in which Anakin could speak if he chose to. And when Anakin acknowledged the trouble without naming its specific source, Palpatine told him a story. He called it the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise. He framed it as legend, as something he had encountered in his years of political education in the obscure corners of galactic history that most people never explored. A Sith Lord, he said, who had developed mastery over something the Jedi had never been able to touch. The Sith Lord had gone further into the nature of midi-chlorians than anyone before him. He had discovered, through decades of research and practice, that the Force was not bound by the boundary that most Force users accepted as absolute, the boundary between life and death. He had found that this boundary was not a wall but a threshold, something that could, in principle, be influenced by someone who understood the deepest mechanisms of the Force well enough. He had developed the ability to prevent death, not in some abstract or symbolic sense. Literally, the people he chose to protect could be kept alive when the Force would otherwise have taken them. He paused there. He let it settle. He did not look at Anakin directly, but was aware, in the way that Palpatine was always aware of everything in his immediate environment, of exactly the quality of attention Anakin was paying to what he had just said. Then he said, Plagueis could not save himself. His own apprentice had killed him before he could apply the knowledge to his own life. But the knowledge had not died with him. It existed somewhere in the tradition that Plagueis had belonged to. The ability to prevent death. The means by which the ones you loved could be kept alive even when the Force seemed to be claiming them. This was real. It was learnable. It was not something anyone in the Jedi Order would have any knowledge of or any interest in exploring, because it existed in territory the Jedi considered forbidden by definition. But it was real. Anakin asked whether it was possible to learn this power. The question was not theoretical. It was not the kind of question you ask when you are curious. It was the question of someone for whom the answer changes everything. Palpatine said, "Not from a Jedi." The conversation at the Opera House did not make Anakin Skywalker a Sith. It did not make him turn away from the Order, or betray his friends, or abandon the commitments of his adult life. It was not that simple, and it was not that quick. But it was the moment when Palpatine placed the key in the door. He did not open the door. He simply ensured that Anakin knew the door existed, and that the key was the kind of knowledge only Palpatine could provide, and that the door, if opened, led to the one thing Anakin feared losing most. He had offered a possibility, a direction, a reason to keep listening to the man who had always been listening to him, and to consider, perhaps for the first time consciously, that the loyalty he felt toward the Chancellor might be worth more to him than the loyalty he had always assumed was foundational. His loyalty to the Jedi Order. The chessboard was set. The pieces had been in motion for years, placed with extraordinary care in a configuration that served only one purpose. Mace Windu was still alive, still seated in the temple, still the most perceptive and most dangerous obstacle between Palpatine and the completion of his plan. Anakin Skywalker was still a Jedi Knight, still a hero of the Republic, still the man that 2 generations of the galaxy's population had been taught to believe in as something close to invincible. Neither of them knew what was coming. Neither of them knew how completely the situation had already been decided. The execution remained. The final sequence of events that would unfold in hours. In the Chancellor's office, in the gathering dark of Coruscant's endless evening, was still ahead. But the outcome of that sequence had been determined long before it began. It had been determined in years of careful conversation, in the slow and patient filling of the gaps in one young man's emotional life, with a false loyalty that felt, from the inside, like the realest thing he knew. What remained now was the detonation. The Jedi High Council made 2 decisions in the final days of the Clone Wars that, taken together, constitute one of the most consequential institutional failures in the history of the Republic. Not because the decisions were individually indefensible in each case. The Council had reasoning that was coherent and arguably correct by the standards of the framework they were operating within. But because the Council made these decisions about a specific person, Anakin Skywalker, without fully understanding what that specific person needed from them, without fully reckoning with the emotional architecture they were dealing with, and without understanding that the man who sat across from them in that chamber had been preparing for exactly this kind of institutional failure for over a decade, and was going to use it. The first decision was the refusal of the rank of Master. Palpatine had appointed Anakin to the Jedi Council as his personal representative, a move without precedent in the history of the Order. A sitting Chancellor appointing a Jedi to the Council was not something the code or tradition had ever established a framework for, because it was not something that had ever happened before. It was, by any reading, a political intrusion into Jedi governance, an assertion of executive authority over an institution that considered itself independent of executive authority. The Council accepted it because the war had eroded the bright lines between Jedi and state to the point where accepting was easier than the alternative. But they accepted it on their own terms. They gave Anakin a seat. They did not give him the rank that came with the seat. Every Jedi who had ever served on the High Council had held the rank of Master. It was not a rule so much as a structural reality. The Council was composed of the Order's most senior and accomplished members, and Master was the rank that reflected that seniority. Sitting on the council without holding the rank of master was, in the history of the Order, not something that had happened. It created a situation without precedent and without clear meaning. A contradiction in terms that was visible to every Jedi in the Order, and that carried an implication no amount of diplomatic language could entirely soften. You are here, but you are not fully here. You are acknowledged, but not trusted. You have been given a seat at the table and simultaneously told that you do not yet merit a seat at the table. The reasoning behind the Council's decision was not unreasonable. Anakin was extraordinarily powerful and had achieved things in the war that no other Jedi had matched. He was also, in the Council's assessment, not yet ready for the rank. Not because of his abilities. His abilities were beyond question, but because the qualities that the rank of master was supposed to reflect emotional maturity, steadiness, the kind of integration between power and wisdom that the code pointed toward, were not yet fully present in Anakin in the Council's judgment. They saw his brilliance. They saw his volatility. They saw the ongoing concern about his emotional attachments, about his relationship with the Chancellor, about the way he sometimes prioritized his own judgment over the Order's guidance in ways that were concerning even when the specific call turned out to be right. They made a decision based on their honest assessment of who he was and what the rank should mean. What they did not see, or did not see clearly enough, was what the decision would mean to Anakin in his current state. They were making an institutional judgment about qualifications and readiness. He experienced it as a confirmation of something he had suspected for a long time, that the Jedi Order did not fully believe in him, that despite everything he had done, every campaign he had fought, every sacrifice he had made, the Council's estimate of his worth was conditional in a way that all their praise and all their reliance on him had never quite overcome. He had been told he was exceptional, and simultaneously told he was not exceptional enough. He had been given a seat, and simultaneously denied the recognition that the seat was supposed to represent. The contradiction was not accidental. The Council had decided it was acceptable, but to Anakin, it did not feel like a considered institutional position. It felt like a message, and the message felt in the place where he kept score of such things, like rejection. He was angry. He was angry in the specific way that someone who has been trying to prove something for a long time and believes they have proven it experiences the denial of that proof, not the explosive, obvious anger that the Council might have noticed and addressed. The cold, quiet kind that settles in and stays, that gets filed away, that becomes part of the lens through which every subsequent interaction is seen. He told Obi-Wan about it. Obi-Wan tried to help him understand the Council's perspective, tried to offer the institutional framing that would make the decision comprehensible rather than personal. And Anakin heard him, because Anakin always tried to hear Obi-Wan and put none of it to use, because the hurt was not in a place that institutional explanation could reach. Then came the second decision, the one that was worse. The Council asked Anakin to spy on Palpatine. They asked him to use his unique access to the Chancellor, the relationship that Palpatine had cultivated for over a decade, the relationship that was one of the most genuine feeling things in Anakin's emotional life, to report back to the Council on the Chancellor's activities. To be their informant, to carry information from private conversations back to the institution that had just refused to fully trust him with a rank, and to do it without Palpatine's knowledge, and to do it because the Council suspected Palpatine of being something he had not yet been confirmed to be. Obi-Wan was the one who delivered this request. He clearly found it difficult. He acknowledged it as something outside the normal expectations of the code. He framed it as a necessity, as something the times demanded, as a duty that fell to Anakin specifically because of the position he occupied. All of this was true. All of it landed very badly. What the Council did not understand was what they were asking Anakin to do emotionally, not just practically. They were asking him to betray one of the people he trusted most. They were asking him to weaponize a relationship that he experienced as genuine and sustaining against the man on the other side of it. They were asking him to act as a spy in a friendship, to take the confidence of private conversations and make them operational intelligence. And they were asking this of a man who placed extraordinary value on loyalty, on the bonds between people who had demonstrated commitment to each other over time, on the specific quality of trust that comes from a relationship long maintained. They were asking him to do something that violated, at the deepest level, his understanding of what loyalty meant. And they were asking it not in the name of a relationship he felt they had honored, but in the name of an institution he was beginning to believe had never fully honored him. He told them he would do it. He said the words, and he walked out of the council chamber carrying something new in the place where his relationship with the Jedi Order had been not hatred, not yet, not anything so simple. A kind of exhausted disillusionment, a recognition that the order he had devoted his life to was an institution in the end, with an institution's priorities and an institution's willingness to use people, and that his own idealized version of what it was had been, at least in part, a story he had been telling himself. This was not a conclusion Palpatine had engineered from the outside. The Council had reached into Anakin's life with both hands and handed it to him directly. He went to Palpatine. He told him. He told the Supreme Chancellor of the Republic that the Jedi Council had asked him to spy on him. He did not do this as an act of political calculation. He did not do it because he had decided to betray the Order. He did it because Palpatine was the person he talked to when things felt wrong, had been that person for most of his adult life, and this felt profoundly wrong, and he did not know what else to do with it. The irony of this, that he was confessing to the very target of the surveillance operation in order to process his discomfort with the surveillance operation, was not something Anakin could see from the inside. From the inside, it was simply what you did when you were troubled. You talked to the person you trusted. Palpatine listened. He expressed concern. He said exactly what was needed, that the Council's request was troubling, that it suggested an overreach of Jedi authority that was worth taking seriously, that Anakin's discomfort with it was not weakness or disloyalty but moral clarity. He did not push further in that moment. He did not need to. The information itself that the Council suspected him, that the noose was beginning to tighten, was the essential thing. He had it now. And Anakin, having given it to him, had crossed a line. Without knowing, he had crossed one. He had allowed the information to flow in a direction that served Palpatine rather than the Order. The relationship had become operational in a way Anakin could not quite see yet. The transition from friend to asset had been completed, and Anakin had participated in it willingly, from love. What came next happened very quickly, in the way that things which have been building for a very long time often do when they finally arrive. The long preparation collapses into a short sequence. The decades of patience discharged themselves in hours. Anakin went to Palpatine again. It was the private office, not a public occasion, not the corridors of the Senate or the box at the opera. The private office, with its curved windows looking out over the endless illuminated grid of Coruscant at night, with its stillness and its intimacy, and the quality of confidential enclosure that Palpatine had always used to make Anakin feel that what passed between them was uniquely important and uniquely real. He had come because the visions were worsening, because the fear had sharpened into something almost unbearable, because the conversations he had been having with himself in the dark, in the space between the dreams and the waking, were becoming increasingly impossible to navigate without the thing Palpatine had hinted at the answer, the knowledge, the specific and terrible hope that the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise had placed in his mind. Palpatine told him the truth. He told him the truth about himself. He told it with a quiet directness that was its own kind of theater. The performance of a man who has decided to stop pretending, who is offering something sacred and dangerous and real. He said that he knew the dark side of the Force. He said that he had, in fact, always known it. He said that he was what the Jedi would call a Sith Lord. He said it plainly, watching Anakin's face, watching the way the information reorganized everything Anakin had believed for over a decade. The information was seismic. Anakin reached for his lightsaber. The gesture was automatic, trained into him, the reflex of a Jedi in the presence of a declared enemy. And Palpatine did not move. He did not reach for any weapon. He did not activate any defense. He sat in his chair and looked at Anakin with an expression that was not defiance and was not fear, but something that was calibrated to land on Anakin as sadness, as a kind of grieved and accepting dignity, as the look of a man who has known this moment was coming and is meeting it with the grace of someone who understands that what matters now is not his own safety, but the person standing across from him. He said, "I know what you came here for." He did not say it as an accusation. He said it as recognition, as the acknowledgement of a man who sees clearly and is not going to pretend otherwise. He said that Anakin had come because he needed what only Palpatine could give him. The knowledge, the ability to do what the Jedi had told him was impossible, and what Palpatine had told him at the opera was not. He said, "I can save Padme from death." The lightsaber did not ignite. What Palpatine had done in the space of 30 seconds was the culmination of everything. He had revealed the thing that should have made him Anakin's enemy and immediately connected it to the thing that Anakin could not live without. He had taken the revelation of his true identity, the revelation that should have been the end of everything, that should have set Anakin's loyalty to the Order blazing into action, that should have resolved every ambiguity and turned it into an argument. An argument that the identity itself was irrelevant compared to what the identity made possible. He was a Sith. The Sith had knowledge the Jedi did not. That knowledge could save Padme. What else, in the end, needed to be said? And Anakin stood there, his hand on a weapon he was not going to use, and understood that the choice he had been moving toward for years, maybe for his entire adult life, maybe since the day he left Tatooine and began the long negotiation with loss, was here, now, in this room, with this man, who was looking at him with an expression of absolute patience and the apparent certainty that the outcome was already decided, that the only question was how long it would take Anakin to accept what he already knew. He left the office. He went to the Jedi Temple. He sat in the council chamber, the empty council chamber, and tried to hold himself together. He told himself he had to inform the council. He told himself what he had just learned was what the council had suspected, and that his duty was clear, and that the man he had trusted for over a decade had just revealed himself to be the enemy of everything Anakin had built his life around. He told himself all of this. He believed all of it. And beneath all of it, like a current under ice, was the other thing. The thing that did not go away regardless of what else was true. The thing that Palpatine had known would not go away. He could save Padme. He did the right thing. He went to Mace Windu. This is worth holding for a moment. Because in the accounting of what happened in the final days of the Clone Wars, it is easy to move past this fact too quickly. Anakin Skywalker, given the most conflicted choice of his life, did the right thing first. He was not a villain who had been waiting for his moment. He was a person in crisis who tried to fulfill his duty even while everything in him was pulling against it. He went to the senior council member present and he told him what he had learned. He told Mace Windu that Palpatine was a Sith Lord. Windu's response was immediate. There was no hesitation, no extensive deliberation, no round of consultations with the full council. He had been sensing this truth for years, had been unable to act on it. And now, a Jedi he trusted had handed him the confirmation he had needed. The time for deliberation was over. He gathered who he could gather quickly. Kit Fisto, Ajan Kolar, Saisi Tin, 3 masters of significant ability who happened to be immediately available and who Windu trusted in a fight. He told Anakin what was going to happen. He said they were going to arrest the Chancellor. Then he told Anakin to stay behind. He told him to remain at the temple and not to take any action. He said it with the authority of a senior master giving a clear instruction, with the implicit weight of council hierarchy behind it, and with what he believed was a legitimate concern about Anakin's judgment in a situation this emotionally loaded. Anakin had just admitted to a close personal relationship with the man they were going to arrest. His objectivity was compromised by definition. Keeping him out of the operation made tactical and institutional sense. Anakin heard it as one more exclusion, one more moment in which the council had assessed him and found him unfit for full participation. He was the one who had found out the truth. He was the one who had brought the information that made the action possible. And he was being sent to his room while the real Jedi went to handle it. This was not how Windu intended it, and was not what Windu was saying. But it was, in the specific and tender place where Anakin had been accumulating injuries for years, exactly what it felt like. He said he would wait. He did not wait. Mace Windu and his 3 companions entered the Chancellor's private office at a moment when the Chancellor appeared to be in consultation, surrounded by the ordinary apparatus of executive power, the documents and the communications, and the quiet gravity of the most powerful office in the Republic. Windu identified himself and stated their purpose with the directness that was characteristic of him. The Republic was under the control of a Sith Lord. They were there to take the Chancellor into custody. He would be held until the Senate could be informed and the Jedi Council could convene in full to determine what came next. Palpatine looked at him for a moment. There was something in that moment, a kind of quality to the stillness before motion, a gathering that any Force-sensitive person in the room would have been able to feel if they had been paying attention to the right things. And then Palpatine moved. He revealed himself in a way that was also, in its own sense, theater. He revealed the capacity he had been concealing for decades beneath the persona of an aging politician. The capacity that was his actual self, the power that 1,000 years of Sith succession had deposited in this one particular body. He moved with a speed that the masters in the room were not prepared for, because they had been preparing to arrest a politician and were suddenly facing something else entirely. He produced a lightsaber from the folds of his robe, a narrow, curved hilt, a weapon of unusual design, and he used it. Aegon Kolar died almost before the engagement had properly begun. Saesee Tiin died seconds afterward. These were Jedi Masters. Skilled, experienced, fully trained, standing in the room with their lightsabers ready. They were dead before they could mount anything that could be called a defense. The speed of it, the ferocity of it, the absolute lack of hesitation with which Palpatine killed them. These things said something about what he was, that no amount of prior intelligence could fully have prepared anyone to receive. He was not hiding behind a political identity because he lacked the power to be anything else. He was hiding because concealment had been the strategy. The power itself was entirely real and entirely terrifying. Kit Fisto lasted slightly longer. He was one of the most skilled fighters in the Order, with a fluidity in combat that had served him in 100 engagements across the war. He lasted seconds more than his companions before Palpatine's blade found him. Then there were two. What followed between Mace Windu and Darth Sidious was a duel unlike anything else in that era. Not because of its duration, which was not long, or its spectacle, though the spectacle was considerable. Because of what it represented, the two beings who had been on a collision course for years finally arriving at the collision. The man who had been sensing the dark side and unable to act on it. The man who had been hiding behind democratic process and manufactured consensus, and the slow, patient accumulation of institutional power. Both of them, finally, in the same room, with the pretense stripped away. Palpatine fought with an aggression and a ferocity that most Force users never came close to exhibiting. He was not a practitioner of elegant, technique-focused combat. He was something rawer than that. Something that had spent centuries being disciplined into focus. And that was now, in this room, being allowed to express itself without the need for any further concealment. He attacked with everything. The dark side poured through him in ways that changed the quality of the air in the room, that affected the temperature and the light, that created the sense felt rather than seen of something enormous and terrible being fully present in a small space. Mace Windu matched him. Not by matching his aggression with equal aggression, Varpad did not work that way, but by doing what Varpad was designed to do. He channeled it. He took the enormous dark side power that Palpatine was pouring into the fight and used it as fuel, feeding it back through his own technique, turning the Dark Lord's own power into the instrument of his containment. The duel moved across the office, through the window, out onto the ledge overlooking the Coruscant skyline. The city spread out below them in the darkness, indifferent to the thing being decided above it. Windu was winning. This is the fact that the subsequent events sometimes obscure, but it is the fact. Mace Windu, in a direct confrontation between his own ability and Palpatine's, was winning. The years of sensing the dark side, the lifetime of developing a form specifically calibrated for exactly this kind of opponent, the absolute honesty with himself that Varpad required and that Windu had never compromised, these things came together into something that pushed Palpatine back, and then further back, and then to the edge. Palpatine's blade went down, his hands went up. The lightning came, then blue and white and terrible. The raw expression of Sith power turned outward at the person who had done what almost no one in the history of the Order had managed to do, and actually backed Palpatine into a corner. Windu deflected it. He used his blade to push the lightning back at its source, and the lightning, redirected, did to Palpatine what it had been directed toward Windu. It hit him. It racked him. It changed his face in ways that would remain changed, that would become, in the years that followed, the most iconic image of what the dark side did to those who wielded it without restraint. Whether those changes were entirely the product of the reflected lightning, or whether Palpatine had cultivated them as part of the final act, whether the disfigurement was something he chose to allow or even to amplify because of what it could be made to accomplish in the next few minutes, is a question that admits no clean answer. What is not a question is what those changes looked like to Anakin Skywalker when he arrived. Anakin arrived. Of course he arrived. The outcome of the entire plan had always depended on this, on the fact that Anakin would not be able to stay away, that the combination of his relationship with Palpatine, his fears about Padme, his inability to simply follow an instruction that required him to sit still while something enormous happened without him, and the Force bond that connected him to the situation with an almost physical pull would bring him through that door at exactly the moment it needed to be opened. Palpatine had not orchestrated Anakin's physical arrival in the room. He had not needed to. He had simply understood, with the precision that came from over a decade of studying Anakin Skywalker with complete attention, that Anakin would come. That when the moment arrived, the moment he had been preparing for, Anakin Skywalker would walk through the door, and so he had arranged everything else around that certainty. What Anakin saw when he entered the office was a tableau that had been shaped, consciously or not, by everything that had preceded it. He saw Mace Windu standing over a figure who appeared broken and diminished, a figure whose face was transformed by suffering into something grotesque, a figure who was on his knees with his hands raised and his body hunched against the ongoing force of the lightning still moving through him. He saw, in other words, the image of a powerful man being destroyed. He saw the image of helplessness, of a body at the mercy of another body, of something terrible being done to someone who appeared no longer able to resist it. And he heard what Palpatine said. Palpatine said, in a voice that had been stripped of its senatorial resonance and reduced to something that sounded genuinely fragile, he had the power to save the one Anakin loved. He said it in those terms, not as a threat, not as a negotiation, not as a political offer, as a confession of the only thing that mattered. He was the only one who had the knowledge. He had been told he was a traitor, but everything he had done had been for Anakin. He needed Anakin's help. Please, one word. Please. What Palpatine had done with that single word was the final distillation of everything. He had understood, with complete accuracy, the one thing that could reach Anakin at that moment. Not argument, not reasoning, not appeal to loyalty or ideology or the structures of power. He had appealed to what Anakin was at his core, someone who could not bear to see a person he loved helpless, someone for whom the image of suffering was not abstract, someone who had stood in a sand dwelling on Tatooine and held his mother while she died and had been unable to stop it, and who had been carrying that inability as a wound ever since. Palpatine was not his mother. The situations were not equivalent in any external sense, but in the deep, primal architecture of Anakin's emotional life, the resonances were exact. A person he cared for, suffering, a window closing, the chance, if he acted now, to do what he had not been able to do on Tatooine. Windu was not looking at Anakin with the expression of a man about to show mercy. He was looking at him with the expression of a man who understood what was at stake and had made a decision about it. He said that Palpatine was too dangerous to be left alive. He said that the process of a trial would give Palpatine too many opportunities to maneuver, too many mechanisms through which the accumulated power of his position could be brought to bear. He said that he had to be stopped now, and that this was how he was going to be stopped. He said it with the authority of a master who had thought this through and was prepared to carry it out. He was right. By almost any strategic calculation, he was right. Palpatine alive in a Republic courtroom was a terrifying proposition. A being of his power and intelligence and accumulated influence, surrounded by lawyers and political allies and the institutional weight of the office he had held for over a decade, given time and legal process to maneuver. Windu had looked at the situation and arrived at the assessment that a Jedi trial was a fantasy, and a Republic trial was a mechanism Palpatine would survive. He was almost certainly correct. But he was also, in this moment, saying something that Anakin could not hear as strategy. He was saying that he intended to kill a helpless person. He was saying it in front of Anakin, in a room where the helpless person was someone Anakin had known and trusted for most of his adult life. Someone who had just said Anakin's name with a specific kind of desperation, and he was saying it with the calm certainty of institutional authority. He was, in the vocabulary of Anakin's inner life, executing someone he had already decided to execute, without giving them the process they were owed. He was acting as judge and as sentence simultaneously. He was doing, at a higher power, what the Council had done when they had decided what to do with Ahsoka before they knew the truth. Anakin said, "He should stand trial." Windu said, "It is not the Jedi way to act in anger." But it was clear in the quality of the moment that he was not speaking from anger. He was speaking from calculation, and Anakin heard it and knew that Windu had made up his mind and understood that the window was closing, and felt, beneath the rationality and the duty and the part of him that knew what Windu was saying was probably strategically correct, felt the other thing. The thing that could not be reached by strategy. The thing that had been living in him since Tatooine and that Palpatine had been tending carefully for over a decade. Padmé's face in the dream. Her face at the end of the dream. He raised his lightsaber. He brought it down, not at Palpatine, but at Windu's weapon arm. The blade took Windu's hand at the wrist. The lightsaber fell. The hand fell. The defense against the lightning was gone. Palpatine moved. What had appeared broken and diminished rose. The voice that had said, "Please," became something else. The energy that had appeared depleted, bent, forced down by the combined weight of defeat and the lightning redirected at its source. This energy did not need time to recover. It had not fully needed to recover. What followed came out of Palpatine with a velocity and a fury that confirmed everything about the performance that had preceded it. The helplessness had been precisely calibrated. The position on the floor, the twisted posture, the raw and damaged voice, these things had been held at the right level. Enough to be credible, not so much that the transition back to power would be impossible. The lightning that poured out of him now and found Mace Windu, found the unarmed and undefended and suddenly one-handed Windu, was not the lightning of a man fighting back from the edge of death. It was the lightning of a man completing a sequence. Windu was hurled through the window. The transparency shattered. The night air of Coruscant, cold and full of the distant noise of a city that never stopped, came rushing in. Mace Windu fell. He fell from a height that no recovery from was possible. Fell through the illuminated dark of the city. Fell away from the office where his life's work had just been undone. Fell from the place where he had come closer than anyone before him to actually stopping the thing that was going to consume the galaxy. Fell in a silence that the wind covered almost immediately. And Anakin stood in the space where the window had been, looking out at the sky where Windu had been, and said, "What have I done?" The question was genuine. In the moment he said it, the full weight of what he had done arrived in him not sequentially, but all at once, the way certain kinds of understanding arrive complete, comprehensive, impossible to unlearn. He had been brought to this room by the fear of losing Padme, and by a decade of carefully constructed loyalty to the man now standing behind him. He had made a choice that could not be unmade in the space between one breath and the next, driven by fear and love, and the specific injury of watching someone he cared for appear helpless. He had acted, and in acting, he had crossed the line that every Jedi was taught to recognize and told never to cross. He had done the thing that the dark side required, the thing that required crossing a boundary that, once crossed, could not be uncrossed. He had committed himself, not to Palpatine, not yet, not in any formal sense, but to the direction, to the consequence, to the world in which Mace Windu was gone, and what that meant about everything that had just happened could not be contained or reversed. He had stepped into a place from which there were only certain paths forward, and the path that led back to the Jedi Order, to Obi-Wan, to the Council, to the vows he had taken and the identity he had built was not among them anymore. He understood this. The understanding was not slow. It came the way the lightning had come, all at once. Palpatine let the question hang in the silence for exactly the right amount of time. Then he spoke, and what he said was the completion of everything. He said, "You are fulfilling your destiny, Anakin." He said it not as a manipulation, or rather not only as a manipulation, he said it as though it was simply true, as though the previous 20-some years of Anakin Skywalker's life had been a path leading here, and the path had finally been arrived at. And there was nothing to grieve about that, because arriving was what paths were for. He said it as a man who had always believed in Anakin and who had been right. He said it, in other words, in exactly the voice that Anakin had been hearing from him for over a decade, and that had become the voice he trusted above all others. He said, "Become my apprentice. Learn to use the dark side. Together, we will save Padme." And Anakin Skywalker, who had been the chosen one, who had been the most powerful Jedi in the history of the Order, who had been the hero with no fear and the brother of Obi-Wan Kenobi and the husband of Padme Amidala and the master of Ahsoka Tano and the general of the 501st, knelt on the floor of the Supreme Chancellor's office and accepted. He accepted because he had nothing left to refuse with. The fear had taken everything, not the dark side as some external force pressing in from outside the dark side, as the final shape of an internal process that had been running since he was a boy, since the first time the universe demonstrated what it was willing to take from him, and he understood at a cellular level that he was not willing to accept it. The fear of loss, grown across 20 years into the only thing with any real authority in his inner life. And Palpatine had found it, had cultivated it, had watered it and tended it, and waited for the precise moment when it flowered into the shape he needed. He gave Anakin a name, Darth Vader. In the tradition of the Sith, the name was not a description of what you were. It was a direction, a designation of what you would become in the service of the dark side. The identity you would inhabit as you left behind whatever you had been before. The name landed in Anakin the way a verdict lands, as something external that nevertheless immediately begins to feel like it was always true, like it was already there, waiting to be discovered. Darth Vader, the new identity for the new reality. The thing that would stand where Anakin Skywalker had stood. What happened next unfolded in hours. The order went out to the clone troopers across every theater of the war. Order 66, the command that had been embedded in their genetic programming since before the war began, the command that had been waiting 10 years to be given. The clones turned on the Jedi Masters, fighting beside them without hesitation, without pause, without the kind of conflict that should accompany the murder of your allies and your generals. They had no choice. The order was not a suggestion. It was hardwired into them by Sith planning that had preceded the war itself, by a design so long in the making that the clones who carried it out had not yet been born when it was first conceived. Jedi across the galaxy died in the moments following the order, died in battle, died in their quarters, died in temples on a dozen worlds, died without understanding what was happening until it was too late to matter. Vader, who had been Anakin Skywalker until approximately an hour before, went to the Jedi Temple on Coruscant with a battalion of the 501st Legion and did what was required. He went because he had committed. Because the commitment, once made, had a logic that did not allow for selective application. You could not say yes to Palpatine and no to the Jedi Temple. You could not take the dark side's promise for Padme without being willing to do the dark side's work. The mind that had always been able to find a way to hold the contradictions, to be the husband and the Jedi, to be the emotional man and the disciplined warrior, to serve the code and the attachment simultaneously, that mind was no longer managing the contradictions. It had resolved them into something that moved through the temple with a lightsaber and a battalion and the name Darth Vader. He believed it was necessary. This is the most important thing to understand about what Anakin Skywalker did in those hours. He was not evil in the way that word is commonly used, was not acting from the desire to inflict suffering for its own sake, was not indifferent to what he was doing. He believed it was the price of Padme's survival. He believed that Palpatine could deliver what he had promised, and that what was being asked of him in return was terrible but not too terrible to pay. He was wrong about this catastrophically, galaxy-alteringly wrong, but he did not know he was wrong yet. He would come to know it. In the agony of what came after, in the specific and particular anguish of what happened on Mustafar, he would come to know it with a completeness that never left him for the remaining years of his life. But in those hours, he did not know. He was still acting on the belief that this was a price that could be paid, and that Padme was at the end of it. Palpatine went to the Senate. He did what he had always intended to do, and had been positioning to do for years. He stood before the assembled representatives of the Republic and told them a story about a Jedi plot to overthrow the government. He told them that he had narrowly survived the attempt on his life, that Mace Windu and his accomplices had come to the Chancellor's office with lethal intent, that the Jedi Order had revealed itself to be what he now claimed it had always been, a dangerous, politically ambitious sect that had operated under the cover of public service while pursuing its own agenda for power. He told them this with the voice of a man who had survived something traumatic and was, despite his suffering, still committed to the republic he served. He told them this with a face that had been changed by the encounter in ways that everyone who looked at him could see, and that changes served him now as evidence, as the visible mark of what had been done to him, as the wound that made the story credible. He announced the transformation of the Republic into the Galactic Empire. He announced the continuation of his own leadership of that empire, not as a chancellor serving at the pleasure of a democratic senate, but as emperor, as the permanent head of a new and different kind of state. The Senate applauded. Padme Amidala, watching from her pod, said, "So this is how liberty dies," with thunderous applause. She was right, and she said it in a way that suggested she understood something, in that moment, about the nature of what had happened, though she could not have known the full shape of it. She could not have known that the vote she was watching, the choice the Senate was making in this chamber, had been predetermined, that the entire sequence of events leading to this moment had been designed by the man standing before them, that the Jedi plot they were being told about was an invention, that the war that had cost the galaxy millions of lives had been fought between two sides, both controlled by the same architect, that the clone army that had saved the Republic had been built for the purpose of destroying it, that the democratic process through which the Republic had functioned for 1,000 years was being replaced not by the failure of democracy, but by its successful corruption, by a plan so patient and so comprehensive that no one had managed to see it whole until it was too late. The empire that Palpatine proclaimed in that chamber was the product of everything that had happened in the Chancellor's office the night before. It was the product of Mace Windu's death. It was the product of Anakin Skywalker's choice at the window. It was the product of a decade of private dinners and carefully managed conversations and a story told at the Opera House about a Sith Lord who had learned to cheat death. It was the product of the Council's two decisions in the final days of the war, the denial of the rank of Master, the request to spy, and of the Ahsoka crisis, and of every engagement in the war that had asked Anakin to make choices that cost him something the Jedi Code could not fully help him carry. It was the product of a boy left behind on Tatooine, and the mother who died there, and the wound that never fully closed. It was all of these things at once, and it was none of them alone. And the fact that it could not be reduced to any single cause was part of what made it so devastating. There was no single moment where a different choice would have changed everything. There were hundreds of moments, thousands, and the man who had designed the outcome had anticipated most of them. What Palpatine had done to Mace Windu was not ultimately about Mace Windu. Windu was the most dangerous obstacle in the final phase of the plan, the Jedi most likely to stop it, and removing him was necessary. But the removal was a means rather than an end. The end was the thing Windu's death made possible. A Sith apprentice who was also the most powerful Force user alive, whose loyalty to the dark side had been purchased at the cost of the deepest love of his life, whose devastation at the price he had paid for that loyalty would make him, in his grief and his rage, the most dangerous weapon in the galaxy. Vader was not simply a replacement for Maul or Dooku or any of the previous apprentices in the Sith line. Vader was something different. Vader was the product of the most elaborate and patient investment of the Rule of Two's entire history. Every generation of the Sith had been building toward the Chosen One, even without knowing it. And Palpatine had found him and turned him. The tragedy of Mace Windu lies not just in the moment of his death, but in the closeness of how near he came to preventing everything. He had the perception, he had the power. He had gotten Palpatine to the edge of the window, disarmed, on his knees, the lightning redirected. The plan in its most vulnerable state. He had done something that no Jedi since the Sith were believed to be extinct had done. He had faced the Dark Lord in direct combat and been on the verge of winning. If Anakin had not come through that door, if the years of cultivation had failed at the final moment, if Anakin's training had won out over his fear, if Windu had been allowed to finish what he started, the history of the galaxy runs in an entirely different direction. Everything that follows, the Empire and the Death Star and Alderaan and all the suffering of the Age of Darkness, does not happen. Or it is delayed, or it takes a different shape. The galaxy's fate turned on a single moment in that office, on the arc of a lightsaber coming down on a wrist. And the margin was that small. But Palpatine had understood for years that the margin would be small. He had understood that the only version of his plan that worked required Anakin Skywalker to be in that room at that moment and to make that choice. And so he had spent years, a decade and more of meticulous and patient work, ensuring that when the moment came, Anakin would be in the room, not by forcing him there, not by commanding or compelling, by making the room the place where the thing Anakin cared about most could be determined, by making Palpatine himself the only possible source of the answer that Anakin needed, by making the Jedi Order, through a combination of its own genuine limitations and Palpatine's careful exploitation of those limitations, feel like a place that had never fully embraced him. He had made himself indispensable and made the Order expendable, and he had done it over years of dinners and conversations and precisely calibrated moments of validation, and when the moment came, it had worked exactly as he had designed it to work. Anakin Skywalker had not been destroyed by an enemy. He had been destroyed by a friend, or by someone who had spent long enough performing friendship that the performance had become, from the inside, indistinguishable from the real thing. This is perhaps the most terrible aspect of the whole story. Anakin's love for Palpatine was genuine. The gratitude was genuine. The sense that Palpatine understood him in ways others did not was genuine in its felt quality, even though the understanding on Palpatine's side had always been instrumental. The Chosen One was brought down not by hatred or temptation in any simple sense, but by something that felt like being loved. That is the particular horror of what Palpatine achieved. He took a man's greatest capacity, his capacity for deep and fierce and uncompromising love, and turned it into the mechanism of his own corruption. What was lost in those hours extended far beyond Mace Windu, far beyond the Jedi Order, far beyond the Republic. What was lost was a human being in the fullest sense of what that means. Anakin Skywalker had been, despite all his contradictions, despite his fears and his rages and the things he had done, that he could not take back a person of genuine goodness. He had loved generously. He had protected those who could not protect themselves. He had fought for things that deserved to be fought for with an intensity and a devotion that were never in question, even when his methods were. He had been capable of extraordinary compassion and of the specific quality of care that comes from someone who knows what it is to be powerless and has decided that no one else will feel that way if they can prevent it. That person did not die at the window of the Chancellor's office. He survived, buried under the new name, and the new identity, and the armor that would eventually enclose him entirely. He survived in the way that things survive, when they are not permitted to be what they are at great cost. In a diminished form, in the part of a person that cannot be entirely taken even when everything else is taken. He survived for years. Through the long dark of the Empire's age, through service to a master whose manipulation had been the instrument of everything he had lost. And eventually, a long time later, on a second Death Star above a moon called Endor, he came back, but that is another story. And Mace Windu was not there to see it. What the man who fell from the Chancellor's window represented was not just a loss of life, though it was that. It was the closing of the last clear path to a different outcome. With Windu gone, with the three masters who came with him gone, with Anakin committed to Palpatine, and Palpatine standing before the Senate, with the script already written, the direction was set. The forces in motion were too large and too fast to reverse. The darkness that the Jedi had been sensing for years, the cloud over their foresight, the nameless wrongness at the center of things, was not going to be named in time to stop what it was doing. It had already done what it came to do. Palpatine had spent 1,000 years getting here. 1,000 years of the Sith tradition, of the rule of two, of each generation passing to the next, the discipline and the knowledge and the patience of the dark side's longest project. He was the culmination of all of it. The chosen one was supposed to bring balance to the Force, and perhaps he did, in the end, in the way the prophecy actually intended, but not in the way the Jedi had hoped, and not in the way Palpatine had planned for. Between the hope and the planning, between the light side and the dark, between what Anakin had been and what he became at the window, the galaxy changed. It changed because a man loved someone too much to open his hands. It changed because an institution trying to protect itself failed the one person who needed it most to reach him. It changed because the patience of evil, sustained across years and decades and lifetimes, is something that goodness in a hurry almost never matches. And it changed because Mace Windu, who saw more clearly than anyone else, who came closer than anyone else, who very nearly did the thing that would have stopped it all, was not allowed to finish. The window is still broken in the telling. The city is still spread out in the dark below it. And somewhere in the distance, falling, is the clearest-eyed Jedi of his generation, the man who felt the dark side and named it and moved against it and was undone not by the dark side directly, but by the love of the man who stood beside him. That is the story. Not of a villain's victory, though a villain won. Not of a hero's failure, though a hero fell. The story of how the thing most worth protecting becomes, in the right hands, the instrument of the destruction of everything it was supposed to save. There is something worth sitting with in the quiet after all of this. Something about the nature of what Palpatine accomplished that goes beyond the political and the military, and even the personal. He did not conquer the Republic by being stronger than it. He did not destroy the Jedi Order by being a better fighter than its best members, though he could fight, and he proved it. He did it by understanding something that both the Republic and the Jedi Order had failed to fully reckon with, that the greatest vulnerabilities of any system are not at its weakest points, but at its strongest ones. That the most dangerous place to strike is not where a thing is broken, but where it is most alive. The Jedi's greatest strength was their commitment to those they served, their capacity for love expressed within the discipline of the code. Palpatine found the one member of that order for whom that love ran deeper than the discipline could reach, and he made the love into the lever. The Republic's greatest strength was its democratic process, its system of representation and consent, its tradition of self-governance that had held for 1,000 years. Palpatine used that process to end itself, used the Senate's own mechanisms to vote the Senate's power away. He did not break the strong things. He turned them against themselves. That is the lesson of what he did, and it is a lesson that applies far beyond a galaxy far away. Strength, when it is not also wisdom, when it is not also the capacity for honest self-examination, when it does not know where its own fault lines are, strength of that kind can be turned. The hand that holds the weapon can be guided. The love that would sacrifice anything can be made to sacrifice the wrong thing. Palpatine knew this and used it and built an empire on it. And in the silence that followed the proclamation, in the stillness after the applause, somewhere in the city below the window, Mace Windu was gone. May the Force be with you, always.